this panel, which of course is part of the India 2047 speaker series, celebrating the 75th anniversary of India's independence. And today's particular session is on education in India in 2047, looking ahead, looking to 2047 and that journey. Now, I'm very conscious of the fact that we're spread around the world, actually, but we can't lose sight of the, despite the power of connectivity, we shouldn't lose sight of the power of places and the places that each of us are in. And on that note, I want to do I'd like to do a land acknowledgement here that relates to the University of Guelph and the lands that the University of Guelph resides on. And the lands of the University of Guelph reside in the ancestral and treaty lands of the Arawandran people and the Mississaugas of the Credit, and we recognize and honor our Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Métis neighbors with the dish with one spoon covenant that speaks to our collective responsibility. And I think we can all relate to this, our collective responsibility to steward and to sustain the land and the environment in which we live and in which we work. So I wanted to share that with the group, despite being virtual, again, that power of place. So let me kick things off by first of all thanking Professor Sharada Srinivasan, again, who is the director of CIRCLE, which is the Canadian India Research Center for Learning and Engagement. I want to thank her for her leadership and for inviting me to moderate this event, which I have to say I'm super energized about, and I'll say a few words about why that is in a moment, but thank you for that. Let me also just remind people a little bit of context in terms of the Canada India Research Center for Learning and Engagement. This is an interdisciplinary nucleus here in Canada for really cutting edge, forward-looking research on India, as well as India diaspora, to showcase, to advocate, to catalyze, and to foster an equitable, respectful, and sustained exchange of knowledge between Canadian and Indian scholars on issues that are both emerging and also very complicated and complex issues that relate to sustainability and social and economic well-being. I will say that as the former chancellor and president until 2020, in case some of you are wondering how far back does this former president go, I finished my term in the summer of 2020, spent the last 6 months in emergency mode dealing with COVID, so it was quite the off-ramp for my presidency. But throughout my time as president, internationalism was a major theme, and basically our connectivity with the rest of the world. But India in particular featured prominently for me in this regard, and it's for a number of reasons that we all here would understand. It's the world's largest democracy, and I would say also that it is a successful stress test for democracy. Just given its size, 1.3 billion people, among the largest economies in the world, home to 3 mega cities, which are defined as over 10 million people, 23 official languages. I mean, we juggle things here politically with 2 official languages, 23 official languages. And so for me, when I think about the concept, when I think about democracy, the world's largest democracy, I think about common purpose, what brings people together, and the capacity to come together. And in this regard, India symbolizes for me the highest of aspirations in this regard, and the power, really the power of the human spirit, to be able to be true to democracy, or strive to be true to democracy, notwithstanding all of the obvious challenges with a country of the size and scope of India. At a personal level, one of the greatest joys from my time as president was the people that I had the opportunity to cross paths with in my role. And in this regard, my travels to India and my many conversations with Sharada really have elevated my appreciation and understanding of the complexities and the opportunities. So this year, of course, the 75th anniversary of India's independence is really an opportunity for us to reflect on where we've been and where India is heading as we move towards 2047, the 100th anniversary. And you know, we think in hundreds, and so when we think about the next 25 years as we complete that 100 cycle, what do we need to be thinking about on that journey over the next 25 years? How education in the workforce in India over the next 25 years will have impact on our world. And you know, some of the questions that I think are going to be important for all of us to think about, and these are things that our panelists will be sharing and giving us insights to. How can universities excel? How can they deliver high human capital to drive the economy? India has the largest youth population, with the average age of an Indian being 28 years old. Rising education has not necessarily matched rising employment. How will India, for example, capitalize on the opportunity of increased education of women? The opportunity, the challenge, but also the opportunity, increased education of women, and build women's empowerment, well-being, and gender equity. How are they going to address this in the years to come? These and many more questions and nuances are what our panelists are going to address today. So what I'd like to do now is just introduce each of the panelists, and I'll introduce all three of our panelists, and then what we'll do is we will have a 15-minute presentation from each of the panelists, and then at the end we will have hopefully about 30 minutes or so, 25 to 30 minutes of opportunity for question period. So let me begin by first introducing Professor Nandini Sundar. She is a scholar of constitutionalism, academic freedom, democracy, law, inequality, and agrarian ecologies. Her recent book, The Burning Forest, India's War Against Maoists, has been translated into Gujarati, Tamil, and Telugu. She's trained at Columbia University. That's where she received her PhD. She's published extensively. I won't go through all the publication. She's widely recognized for her scholarship, having received a number of important prizes, awards, and recognitions. And she demonstrates her constant bridging of academic successes with public discourse, and that's evidenced also through her considerable media involvement. So Professor Sundar will be our first speaker, but like I said, I'll introduce all three of them at this point. And by the way, Professor Sundar will be speaking on universities in India 2047. Our second panelist will be Professor Ashwini Deshpande, Professor of Economics at Ashoka University, will be speaking to us on India 2047, gender equality at work and at home. Professor Deshpande is an economist focused on discrimination and affirmative action, founded and leads the Center for Economic Data and Analysis at Ashoka University. She's extensively published, including The Grammar of Caste, Economic Discrimination in Contemporary India, which analyzes the degree of change of the caste system using national level data. She was trained at the Delhi School of Economics, received her PhD in '94. Professor Deshpande has been teaching economics since 1990 and has been awarded a number of outstanding awards, including the Exim Bank Award for Outstanding Dissertation as well as other awards. So again, welcome, Professor Deshpande. And finally, Professor Rukmini Banerji. Professor Banerji is a prominent India educationist who strongly advocates for systematizing preschool and anagwandis and in 2019, Professor Banerji said that the biggest development challenge that India faces is preparing our young people for the future. Trained at the University of Chicago, PhD in 1991, she has worked closely with federal and state government of India to shape the child education policy. She also, I should mention, led PRATHAM's annual status of education report from 2005 to 2014. And Dr. Banerji is the CEO of PRATHAM and PRATHAM USA. Professor Banerji is a lauded scholar, a recipient of a number of key awards, including an important award by the government of Bihar in 2008 and the Yidan Prize for Education Development this year. And the title of Professor Banerji's talks will be Every Child in School and Learning Well from Vision to Reality in 2047. And so those are the introductions. I don't want to go on much longer at all, but just a couple of very quick logistical points before I pass it on to Professor Sundar. So the speakers will each speak for 15 minutes. We'll have opportunity for questions at the end. At the end, and I'll remind people again, you can raise your hand, a virtual raising of the hand if you have a question you'd like to ask. As well, if you want to do it through chat, I'll try to keep an eye on my chat button here, and we can try to also address any questions that way. So without any further ado, let me now pass it on to Professor Sundar to kick things off. You're on mute. There we go.
Yeah, sorry about that. Yes. Thank you, Professor Vaccarino and Professor Srinivasan and everybody else at Circle for organizing this and for inviting me. It's really a pleasure and a privilege to be part of this conversation. So let me just launch straight away into what I have to say, given that we have 15 minutes. So when we look back at 1947 and look forward to 2047, I think the first question that we need to ask ourselves is, what are universities for? What was the vision that was articulated in 1947, and how well have India's universities performed on these fronts? And do we need a new vision going forward? So to answer the question of what universities are for, I list the following, although these are not in any particular order. One, to train human resources to power the nation's growth. Second, to enable social mobility through education in order to reduce inequality. Third, to keep alive a spirit of inquiry and criticism. And fourth, to push the frontiers of research. Broadly speaking, these are goals that successive commissions on higher education, such as the Radhakrishnan Commission of 1948-49, or the Kothari Commission of 1964, 1966, the Yashpal Commission of 2009, and even the latest national education policy have highlighted. For instance, the Radhakrishnan report states, and I quote, "Higher education is undoubtedly an obligation of the state, but state aid is not to be confused with state control over academic policies and practices. Intellectual progress demands the maintenance of the spirit of free inquiry. The pursuit and practice of truth, regardless of consequences, has been the ambition of universities," unquote. The Radhakrishnan report also emphasized democracy within the university and the importance of engaging with the surrounding environment of, I quote, "being alive to the needs of the society in which they live," unquote. The Kothari Commission of the 1960s was equally clear that universities must serve as, I quote, the conscience of the nation, that universities are, and I'm quoting here, universities are preeminently the forum for a critical assessment of society, sympathetic, objective, unafraid, whose partiality and motives cannot be suspected. That faculty should live by the values they teach and should resist becoming organization men, eager to suck up to the powers that be, unquote. For the Kothari Commission, it was imperative for Indian universities to shake off the examination culture in which they had originated, to impart a sense of Indian heritage, and to be independent and autonomous rather than dependent on international discourses and technology. Which is why they advocated the setting up of elite institutions such as in engineering and centers of advanced studies. Now, not all of these goals, skilling, critical inquiry, research, are in harmony or in perfect harmony with each other. For instance, many of us know how teaching takes away from research and vice versa. There are also many functions which a good university performs on the side, such as which may or may not be part of its explicitly stated goals, but which are very important to the lived experience of a university in an ideal sense, such as bringing people from different strata of society together, encouraging forms of association between young people of very different backgrounds. While these goals of inquiry, of criticism, of research, of training, etc., may and indeed must be tweaked, I believe they do provide a sufficient template going forward. Universities globally are struggling to redefine themselves with rapid technological change, the growing precarity of staff, stringent audit cultures, and the fate of the Indian university will depend in part on international trends. Both in India and globally, we are yet to fully grapple with what a post-pandemic higher education landscape would look like. Clearly, online courses will expand. There are changes to our understanding of the knowledge commons with sites like LibGen and others being tested for their legality, and people protesting against the high monopoly fees that private journal networks charge. So there are all sorts of changes that are happening that are going to affect how universities in India will react going forward. But what I want to talk about today is a little bit about the specificities of the Indian experience. And for that, I need to first lay out some figures on the Indian higher education landscape. I'm drawing on the All India Survey of Higher Education for 2019-20, which is the latest document that we have. The number of colleges and students has grown massively in India, from 20 universities and 500 colleges in 1947 to 1,043 universities, 42,343 colleges, and 11,779 standalone institutions, research institutions, other forms, in 2019-20. 307 of these universities are affiliating universities, which means that they have colleges attached to them. And some of these universities, like the one at which I teach, Delhi University, are incredibly large. So Delhi University started in 1922 with 3 colleges and 750 students, and now has 16 faculties or graduate schools, over 80 postgraduate departments, 91 colleges, and over 700,000 students. Perhaps the only comparable institution in terms of size is Beijing University, which, however, far outflanks Delhi University in terms of global rankings. Of these universities, a little over a third and 78% of the colleges are privately owned. And 60% of these colleges are located in rural areas. About 80% of the students overall are located in undergraduate programs, and only about 0.5% are doing PhDs. Of these undergraduate students, over 1/3 are in a BA program, followed by 16% in science and 14% in commerce. So what are the implications of this predominance of private colleges despite the centrality of a public sector funded central university system? Partly the fact of this private management, apart from the sort of few liberal arts universities which are just which have come up recently, such as Ashoka, the fact that so many of them are privately owned has serious implications for academic freedom and academic autonomy. If you look at the density of colleges across India, it follows very closely the political economy of those states, with states like Karnataka having a high density of colleges, both in rural and urban areas, which sort of reflects the power of the local bourgeoisie, where colleges are seen as an easy way to both park your money earned from other sectors as well as to make money. And many of these colleges, because they're privately owned, do not really countenance much criticism either from students or from faculty. There's also a huge shadow economy of coaching colleges, whether to get into engineering or medical courses or into the civil services, which actually constitute the university experience of many young people today. And of course, there's also the growing exodus of middle-class students to universities abroad, even at the undergraduate level, which perhaps wasn't there a couple of decades ago. So I think we can broadly expect these trends to continue till 1947, with some shifts corresponding to changes in the political economy of employment and perceived prospects. For instance, last year, a large number of engineering seats went vacant because students shifted from engineering to medical courses. To come to the social breakup of this higher education enrollment, the total enrollment is estimated as 38.5 million, or 27.1% of the population in the age group of 18 to 23, with almost equal percentages of men and women. So compare this 27% to 54.4% in China, or 88% of the gross enrollment ratio in the US. So clearly India still has a long way to go in reaching the kind of tertiary access that we need. But if you look at the kind of composition of the student population, women actually constitute about 49% of the total enrollment. And even though the gross enrollment ratio is lower for scheduled castes and scheduled tribes or indigenous people, the percentages of these students in the student population is more or less the same as their percentages in the population at large. So, given India's history of quotas or affirmative action, with some gaps, the university system has more or less been successful in becoming socially representative insofar as those enrolled go. The worst off, however, are Muslim students, who constitute only 5.5% of the population, which is much, much lower than their percentage in the total population. It's only recently that Muslim students have begun to receive any kind of affirmative action, despite evidence that poverty figures among Muslims are almost as bad as SCs and STs in many ways. So the inclusivity of the higher education system as far as Muslims go is something definitely to be worried about. So to come back to my original matrix of what universities are for, I think we can say that insofar as the first two goals go, of training human resources and enabling social mobility, universities in India have been trying at least to respond to these demands. even if the numbers of those enrolled have to be expanded to meet international standards, and the kind of education that students may be getting in these colleges may leave much to be desired. For instance, we've recently had, it's going on right now, where women students in colleges in Karnataka, one of the southern states, are being prevented from going to college because they wear hijabs, and they're being attacked by saffron shawl wearing youth who are kind of heckling them and harassing them. So you really wonder what kind of education these right-wing youth are getting when they try and assault their own college co-college students, and when they rake up these kinds of issues. And perhaps they are learning more from what is called WhatsApp University now in India, where everybody seems to be getting their information from. And expenditure on India on education has hovered at around 3%, despite repeated assurances that it will go up to 6%. And much of this is directed at elite institutes of technology, or what are now called institutes of eminence, which are really designed to crack the global rankings. However, so I'm not that worried about, yes, investment in education, the nature of skilling, all of that is a problem. But these are problems that can be addressed given, some degree of will. However, it is the other two aspects of what universities, of the sort of core goals of universities, which are of serious concern in India today. And these are pushing, research and keeping alive inquiry and criticism. So although, it's debatable whether stifling academic freedom will necessarily end critical research as well. For instance, we know that Nazi Germany was excessively, was doing very well in the sort of scientific field of scientific development, even though later research coming out of those universities was discredited. But really, it is increasingly going to be difficult to do any kind of research, both in the sciences and humanities, under conditions where money is diverted to kind of spurious research projects like, the value of cow urine, or, if social scientists in particular are prevented from studying a variety of different issues. Since 2014, India has slipped drastically in global indices such as academic freedom and democracy. For instance, in the 2020 scale academic freedom index of the VDEM Institute, India had a score of 0.3 on par with Saudi Arabia and Libya. What Indian universities will look like in 2047 depends, among other things, on the political and electoral choices made from now on, though in many ways it may be actually too late to undo the damage. Some changes can be addressed, such as this arrests and suspensions of students and faculty who are critical of the regime, the bans on certain books being taught in universities, the overall climate of censorship, the general climate of hostility to critical inquiry, which has resulted in a large number of extracurricular activities being disrupted. So even before COVID, even before the lockdown, the DU campus was becoming a very dead place, with the university refusing to allow discussion on contemporary issues due to fear of disruption by the ABVP, the student wing of the RSS. So all of that, yes, if we have a new government, perhaps, all of that will stop. The universities will open up in an intellectual sense. However, the more important concern is that in the public sector, sort of flagship universities of the country, academic appointments that are being made now, both at the level of the heads of institutions and hires down the line, will be much harder to reverse, because we're talking about people who will then reproduce through future appointments for the next 20, 30 years. Take JNU, for instance, where the incoming Vice-Chancellor seems to have been selected with the sole purpose of completing the demolition job begun by her predecessor. JNU is one of, I mean, at least has been one of India's top ranking universities. And over the last 5 or 6 years, there's been, all sorts of attacks on its autonomy, academic freedom of both students, faculty, and of research. So looking forward to 2047, I want to put my faith, first of all, in the young people of this country. In the first Modi term, students at central universities were in the forefront of protest, demanding quality education, scholarships, equality in hostel timings, etc. Now, years later, there is somewhat of a more subdued, arrested, scared lot living in an increasingly polarized world with fewer job opportunities and fewer safety nets than ever before. But if universities are to grow and change, they will have to respond to demands for greater investment in equality education at all levels, for a curriculum which is more attentive to people's existing knowledges. At a time of climate change, we have to stop the process of de-skilling and restriction of knowledge into narrow industrial avenues that we've been seeing so far. We need to incorporate all the existing indigenous knowledge there is in agriculture, architecture, fishing, a variety of other occupational skills. We need an expansion of learning in vernacular languages, simultaneous with learning English, not one at the expense of the other, and a greater cosmopolitanism on campus, and above all, a reduction in discrimination on the grounds of caste, gender, sexuality, or ability, a safer campus for women and minorities. But for all of this to happen, India has to change, and change fast, by 2024, because 2047 is not so far away. So thank you, and I'll stop with that.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much, Professor Sundar. There's a lot of food for thought there, and I'm sure that people in the audience have all sorts of questions and comments and points of discussion. But like I said, what we were gonna, if people could just hold on to their thoughts until the end, and then we'll have a broad discussion. So let me now take this opportunity to again welcome and introduce Professor Deshpande, who will be talking to us today about gender equality at work and at home. So over to you, Professor Deshpande.
Thank you very much. I echo Nandini's sentiment for thanking the organizers to invite me to this event. I am actually going to not talk so much about education, but about work, something that in a way follows education. And I want to reflect a little bit about gender equality at work, both at home as well as in paid work. And the reason for this is that while the introductory remarks, Professor Vaccarino talked about the enormous dividend that India has because of its young population and women being more educated. The fact is that when you look at women in paid employment, then one of the problems that academics and policymakers have been grappling with is the recorded female labor force participation rate of India, which has been stubbornly low, is now declining. Now, what this means in terms of how it's counted, etc., these are all technical issues, and I'm not going into it right now. But it's the reason that it's puzzling is because globally, when you look at female labor force participation rate, you observe through history that there are certain preconditions that society had to meet before female labor force participation rate or women's participation in paid work increased. As it turns out, India has already those preconditions in place. So for example, maternal mortality rate in India has been steadily declining and is fairly low by the standards of the developing world. Education levels of women have been increasing. In fact, if you look at the increase over the last decade, the rise is higher, sharper than that for men. And so male-female gaps, at least in the quantity of education, have either been eliminated or are getting eliminated at higher levels. Of course, the quality differences still remain, and that's something to worry about. Fertility rates have been going down. So Indian families are getting smaller. India is now near replacement levels of fertility, which is basically on average 2 children per family. Elsewhere, historically, these conditions have coincided with a rise in female participation in paid work, but not in India. And it's a puzzle. And also, I mean, now Indian rate of growth of the economy has not been high for the last 6-7 years. But there was a time when, for at least for 2 decades, where India had also witnessed a sharp, a high rate of growth. And so all of these conditions together should have ensured a greater participation of women in paid work, but that didn't happen. That hasn't happened. And one explanation for this persistently low level, not so much the decline, but the persistently low level, is that Indian women, like their counterparts in South Asia, particularly Pakistan, are predominantly responsible for what feminists call reproductive labor or domestic chores. Reproductive labor doesn't only mean the actual act of giving birth to children, but it's to do with cooking and cleaning and washing dishes and keeping the house, getting vegetables, filling water, etc. And of course, the care responsibilities, taking care of children as well as taking care of the elderly. And India and Pakistan share this one thing in common, which is women spend as much as 10 times more hours on reproductive labor than men do. So the gender inequality of sharing domestic work is very, very high in South Asia, India and Pakistan in particular. And this feature prevents women from accessing opportunities when they exist. But I think the corresponding story in India, which particularly relates to the decline, is that opportunities that are able to employ women or use female labor have been declining. So what you see as a decline in female labor force participation rates, a large part of it also reflects a decline in paid opportunities. So number of women or proportion of women who work in paid work hasn't declined. It's the number of hours they are able to work because there isn't much paid work available. That has declined, and that shows up as a decline in female labor force participation rates. And my submission is that gender inequality in domestic work mirrors gender inequality in paid work. So as women are caught up inside the home, taking care of the domestic responsibilities, they are less able to go out and work. And I have some suggestions about how that should break. And hopefully by 2047, we should be able to see a reversal of this vicious cycle. Now, one of the key sort of factors that underlies all of this is what is known as son preference. Now, son preference is this desire to have at least one son or a certain number of sons over daughters. What is happening in India is that son preference as a desire, or the feeling, the need for a son, particularly for old age support, remains strong, but the family size is shrinking. So as a result of which, either families are resort to sex-selective abortions, which by the way are illegal in India, but it's done on the sly, or increasingly we've also been seeing this issue of what are called unwanted daughters, which is, so I put unwanted in question marks, which is girls born in the process of parents wanting a son. What that means is that families end up with daughters that they didn't really want in the first place. And that has, implications for the girls involved, the quality of education, for example, that the girls receive, or the quality of healthcare that the girls receive. So gender discrimination within the household is related also to this phenomenon of son preference. And it's the unwanted daughters or the excess daughters that get born when the parents are actually seeking a child. Now, so all of these factors combine in a vicious circle. how can they be broken, or can they be broken at all, right? And so we do have examples in the world where this strong stranglehold of son preference did get broken. There are examples like China, North Korea, etc., which for various reasons, those solutions may not be possible in other contexts. But if you look at South Korea, which also had and continues to have strong son preference, what ended up happening in South Korea is urbanization created job opportunities for women. And women demonstrated that they were as able to provide old age support as their brothers were, or as the men were. And as parents realize that basically it's the child who's closer by who's going to be able to provide old age support, the material basis for son preference started to weaken. And we see that happening right now in Bangladesh. As women are becoming economically, are getting engaged in economic work, the material basis for son preference is weakening. In fact, in a qualitative surveys in Bangladesh, parents actually say that daughters are better, they care for us more, So we would actually, we don't really necessarily need a son, right? And so in India too, I think that the way to break this vicious cycle would be to make women economically independent, to create opportunities for women to be involved in paid work outside the home. And I think that it's provision of opportunities for economic independence of women. That's, I think, in my mind, going to break this vicious cycle. And I think that's the biggest challenge for India going forward in the next 25 years. Now, there's huge amounts of academic work on all of these issues that I'm talking about. And people, particularly these days, economists have started focusing a lot on social norms. And there are, tons of experimental studies that talk about behavioral nudges to shift the needle on patriarchal social norms. Now, I think that because these norms are rooted in the socioeconomic realities of society, it's behavioral nudges can only do that much, So I don't think that the solution going forward is to provide behavior. It's not as though people believe in patriarchal norms because they don't know better. It's not ignorance that's causing it. It's a certain combination of material realities that make people rely on their sons for old age support, as a result of which son preference remains strong, etc., etc. So it all follows. So in order to loosen the stranglehold, it's never going to happen by changing people's minds. That's not how women have been drawn into the fold of economic independence or paid work elsewhere in the country. So I think we should learn lessons from history as well as from our neighbors that have, broken this stranglehold in different ways. And so I think we need to focus on creating opportunities for women, which means that employers, whether it is government or the private sector, have to be, specifically aware of creating equal opportunities for women at all levels of the workforce. And part of the reason that women lose out on the opportunities, particularly in the private sector in India, is because private sector jobs are seldom advertised. They are most of the times, they're filled up with networking, through networks. And because women are not already in paid work, their networking opportunities are zero, basically, because most of the times they are with their friends or relatives. And so providing, allowing women to create cooperatives. I'm using networking opportunities, but don't think of it as corporate networking. What I'm saying is that creating networks of women that will then have a cascading effect in terms of allowing women to participate in paid work and gain economic independence. Now, all these issues that were already fairly serious have been exacerbated in the last 2 years because of COVID-19. Schools in India have had amongst the longest school closure. Rukmini, I'm sure will talk about this in greater detail. And the digital divide. Basically, what that's meant is that mothers and girls have been disproportionately affected. Girls have not been able to access online education, just as even boys from poorer families have not been able to access. Mothers have had to take huge amounts of responsibility because children are at home, and women in paid work, already low, have disproportionately been disadvantaged and fallen out of the workforce through the years of the pandemic. There seemed to be a slight recovery, but as you see, this graph that my center CEDA produced, that recovery has really has been quite illusory. And so what do we do? It seems like a very intractable problem, but I think that there are practical solutions, some of which might be small in themselves, but together they can create a climate of change so that we, from a vicious cycle, we start getting onto a virtuous cycle. Okay. So first is identification of the problem, not denial, but, identification of the problem. What is it that constrains women prevents job from going to women? Is it gender discrimination? It could be overt or it could be covert. Hiring managers just don't pay attention to gender. That could also be an issue. It could be direct discrimination. We don't want women, or indirect discrimination, which means that conditions remain the same for everybody without taking into account the special constraints that women face, right? So all of this is within the purview of policy, and I don't mean only government. I mean corporate sectors, the private sector as well. It requires stronger laws. It requires sensitization. There are transportation bottlenecks. There are sanitation bottlenecks. Sometimes it could be as simple as a workplace not having a toilet for women, which makes it very unusable for women. And so a small change like that can change the climate of a workplace. So A, first admitting that there is a problem. B, identifying the constraints and working towards solutions to break those. The reason that I'm saying this with such certainty, that if you identify the constraints and provide women with opportunities, they will take those up, is when you look at, for example, the Rural Livelihoods Program in India, which consists of self-help groups. Millions of women have been mobilized in SHGs. These are very poor, marginalized women, where the cost of attending a meeting a week is actually pretty high. But women do it voluntarily and derive immense benefits, not material benefits, but benefits of being in a collective that's not based on family. There's a huge literature on the impact of self-help groups. So women are willing to step out of the home and join an activity if they feel that it's going to benefit them, right? In urban areas, now these self-help groups are of course rural, and they are not yet at scale which will convert women into entrepreneurs. These are very sort of basic level activities, but they can become the vehicles of providing employment opportunities in the rural areas that go beyond Asha, Anganwadi, and the nurses, ANMs, auxiliary nurses and midwives. In urban areas, childcare is a constraint in a way that it's not so binding in rural areas. So without affordable and good quality childcare, women cannot go to work because their single generation families are more common in urban India than they are in rural. Supposing there was a canteen at the workplace which provides decent, affordable food, or a tiffin service that lowers the burden on women to cook everybody's meals before leaving for work. So it's again a simple thing, but it can have huge cascading effects, as indeed we saw in China, after the Chinese Revolution. Tiffin services can provide employment opportunities to women who want to work from home, as well as alleviate a big constraint to women going out to work. So again, each of these might seem like a part of the solution, but all the parts can come together to create a solution. Entrepreneurship, a lot of effort, a lot of attention is paid to women's entrepreneurship, but unfortunately, all the schemes that we have focus on stereotypically feminine sectors. So if it's women, teach them to become beauty salon, operators, or give them stitching training. Not all women might want to become, to work in a beauty salon. Besides, in a village, how many beauty salons can there be, right? And so women have aspirations that are just as big and just as wide as the men are, and recognizing them and training them and skilling them in that, and allowing their natural talent to flourish would be something that would be very, very important. But for all of this to happen, we need to make sure that there is representation of women in all decision-making bodies that affect their lives. And I don't mean, again, only government, at whether it's the private sector, whether it's the corporate sector or the government, everywhere decisions get made that affect the lives of women. And unless women are represented in those, at those levels, the problems are not going to be solved. And of course, I'm using women as a homogeneous category. I'm all too aware that there are categories within women, and we have to look at specific problems of intersectionality to create all these challenges. And finally, I will end with by saying that at the end of the day, when we talk about the gender dividend, the demographic dividend, women's agency is paramount. Women, just like men, have to be allowed to wear what they would like to wear, eat what they would like to eat, marry whoever they would like to marry. They must have, agency in reproductive choices within the home and outside. That's the kind of India that we want to see in 2047. Thank you very much.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Professor Deshpande. Really another thought-provoking presentation with, I'm sure, many questions. So let's keep moving so we make sure that we get to that point where we can have an open discussion. And let's move on now to Dr. Banerjee. And I referred to him as professor, and he sent me, you sent in the chat a note to correct that to doctor, but I will say that although I said Professor Banerjee and officially or technically not correct, in spirit, I'm going to say Professor Banerjee. Dr. Banerjee, welcome, and please, over to you.
Thank you so much, Franco. This is fascinating. We are starting from university, going to the world of work, and I'm going to talk a little bit about school education. And I'm mindful that we need to save some time for all these patient listeners to actually ask questions or comment. What I'm going to do is take a quick look back last 20 years and then think about what has been achieved in the last 20 years, which could help us think about what changes need to happen in the 20 years or more that to get us to 2047. And I'm going to use very, very simple sort of trends over time and numbers. I'm not showing you any slides, but I think the numbers are very clear. So if we think about primary education or elementary education, in the last 20 years, big changes, big push, so much so that I think we can now say that almost every habitation in India has a primary school that has been provided for by the state. And we see that our enrollment numbers are almost, for the last 10, 12 years, have been more than 95% across the country. So universal elementary coverage, and of course, there is still the last 5%, the last mile, which always tends to be the most difficult. But it seems like we have managed to get at least a bulk of our children into school. Very often we look at these as aggregate numbers, and this is a number that perhaps Ashwini will find interesting, that if we looked at grade 8 10, 12 years ago and look at the enrollment there, we had somewhere around 11, 12 million who were in school. And if we look at our census numbers from the last census, very broadly speaking, we have about 25 million in every single year age group. So 10, 12 years ago, we had about half the age group that was reaching 8th grade, which is the end of our, at the time it was not compulsory, but now it is compulsory schooling. But if you look at the same number, 8th grade enrollment in say 2017 or 18, that number is close to 22 million, which means that over these last 10 years in particular, not only are kids being enrolled in school, they are remaining enrolled for a long period of time. And Ashwini, I invoked you because my own home state of Bihar, if you look at these numbers of 8th grade boys and girls, it starts very low for both and much lower for girls. But in the same 10 years period of time, the girls have kind of numbered the boys in terms of reaching 8th grade. Now, all of these, as you look ahead, will have implications for what we are doing. But every time I talk about enrollment, I'm reminded of a young boy. I think he was in a school somewhere in central UP, a rural school. And I was in the classroom and I was asking kids to read what was on the board. And in many of our schools, we always have the attendance and the enrollment numbers for the day on the blackboard. But the word for enrollment in Hindi is quite complicated, namankan, and the word for attendance is upasthiti. So I wasn't actually interested in enrollment or attendance. I wanted to see if the kids could read the words. And so one young kid in 4th grade stood up and read the word namankan, and I was very impressed. And I asked him, what does it mean? And he gave me the best definition of enrollment I've ever heard. He said, it means that my name has come to school. And so I said, and you? And he said, I come also sometimes. So I think that we have this massive pride in having provided for schools everywhere and high enrollment numbers. But we have to remember it's your name who's come to school. And until you follow your name every day, all the time, it doesn't translate into, and it's not, you don't even translate into the first step of what you want to do. So if you take an attendance map of India, you will find that there are states in which enrollment and attendance are pretty close to each other. And on a random day, if you visit, you will find similar high numbers. And then there are states like my own home state or several other northern states where attendance is, much lower than enrollment, and attendance is sometimes, even lower than 60%. And so challenges of having everyone enrolled but only coming sometimes are large because it's very difficult to know who to teach and what. But if we move to one of the main preoccupations that I have had and my organization has had for the last 20 years, it is that, even in the economics literature until quite recently, years of education was used as a proxy for everything that happens that improves your human capital. And so you use years of education to say that more years of education are better than less years of education. And there are correlates to wages and opportunities and so on and so forth. But I would say that again, in these last 20 years, there have been now, different kinds of empirical research, which shows that these years of schooling and the value add for every year you spend in school is not moving at the same rate. And so you may have very high years of schooling, but the years of learning can be quite low and then remain flat. And the ASER report, the annual status of education report that we have been bringing out in India since 2005. So today we are in 2022, and we've been measuring basic reading and basic math now for all those years. This morning, in fact, we released a ASER report for the state of West Bengal. And I will say that, there have been, of course, minor incremental changes, but by and large, if you took the 2005 ASER report and you took the latest full report, which is 2018, you just changed the headings of the tables, it hasn't changed very much. We still are at a level where half the children in grade 5, so 5 years of schooling, and only 50% are still only at 2nd grade level. Some of them may be higher, but a full 50% is not even at, after 5 years, is not even at a 2-year mark. So this is the level of, where we are at with a very, very basic aspect of human capital. Learning levels, basic learning levels have been low. They have been very relatively flat as kids get older. And within any grade, there is a very wide variation of learning levels. Now, the new education policy India has a new education policy, very dramatically released right in the middle of the pandemic in about end of July 2020. And in a way, the new education policy, I think it's a 56-page policy. But to me, the most significant text box is on page 8. And the text box says that if in the next 5 years, we don't achieve universal foundational literacy and numeracy, by the time the kids get to the beginning of 3rd grade, the rest of the policy is irrelevant. To me, this is a very, very bold statement. And I think that whoever was behind the writing of this policy, at least up to the primary stage, has really captured what is the real bottleneck in terms of helping to move the curve much further along. And if my bottleneck gets mine, or sort of India's bottleneck gets dealt with, then I think Ashwini and Nandini will be making a different presentation, 20 years from now. So what do we have to do? So today in India, if I look at 3rd grade, so 2 years into school, if I look at 3rd grade, and I'm using our USSR data, which is very simple data, but large data from many years in the country, we are at pre-COVID, 3rd grade for all of rural India, children going to all kinds of schools, we were at 30%. So only 3 out of 10 children in 3rd grade were at grade level. And we all know that in India, and I don't know about university, I was in university too long ago, but I would say all through school, we follow a very age grade linear progression. So if you're in 3rd grade, then the teacher is teaching from the 3rd grade textbook. If you're in 6th grade, she's teaching from the 6th grade textbook. And so there is this linear progression. And so already by the first 3 years of school, you've lost 70% of the kids. What the new education policy is saying is that we need to get this 30% up to 100%. And that it's saying that in a year or in the years where 1st and 2nd grade, today kids who are enrolled in 1st and 2nd grade, schools are still closed in many places, just about opening up. They've never had preschool, they've never had any school, they've come literally from their parents' laps into the classroom. So you clearly can't do the 1st or 2nd grade curriculum with them. So our business as usual leaves 70% kids behind. If we want to leap into becoming all the different things that India should become, then one of the first things we have to do is to fix this early problem in the way that we can. And again, remember, with 25 million children in each age group, if you take the age group, if you take kids who are at age 3 today and think of the next 5 years, then, and you think of each subsequent cohort, we are talking about 150 million children and the next 5 years. And if we don't achieve this one very basic task, is to get them to learn how to read, to do basic math. And not just that, when you learn to read, you've got to learn to think about what you've read as well. You've got to express your views. But if you put that whole basket of foundations in place, it's only then that you will have a growth or a development or I mean, at some level, I also believe that if all of this foundation is done well, it should lead to a much more critical thinking and assessing population. But if you don't do all this in the next 5 years with the next 150 million who are in school, this 2047 is just another date that will show up, and we'll still be talking like what we are talking today. So Sharda, I'm going to stop, because I want to make sure that we all have things to talk about. But thank you so much for inviting me. And remember, if you don't get this job done, the rest of everything you do in education is irrelevant.
Wonderful. Well, thank you again, Dr. Banerjee, for that presentation. And now we're going to open it up for questions and commentary. I certainly have my share of thoughts, but let me begin by picking something up that was asked about in the chat, and it pertains to the impact of the pandemic. And I thought it was an interesting question that was framed in a particular way that looked at the future, the post-pandemic world. And I guess in some ways asking the question that given the increasing social centeredness and progressive thinking that has been a response to the pandemic that's brought us together and, made us so conscious of the interdependency on each other. Do you think that the post-COVID era might is there an opportunity here to increase the focus on education with a socially centered emphasis that can be, I guess, accelerated or catalyzed by, you know, our COVID experience moving into post-COVID era? And it was directed at Professor Nandini, but it was also directed at the entire panel. So maybe we can start with Professor Sundar, I should say, and then open it up a little bit.
Thank you. That's a very good question. And I really don't have the answer because universities here are just about beginning to open up. So Delhi University is still online. So I'm not sure what a post-pandemic university will look like. And what space there will be for social justice issues to come forward. I mean, one thing that may happen is that, you know, students, after having been barred from seeing each other physically for the last 2 years, will actually begin to have these conversations. One is that they may just be absent from the university because we don't know if this period has actually changed people's attitudes towards physical attendance in universities. So I really am not sure about that.
Great. Well, let me, by the way, let me just mention, I should have done this. I'd like to identify where the question is coming from, and that question came from Shmuel Yerushalmi, and maybe I don't know if Doctors Banerji and Deshpande have any other comments before I move on to the next questions.
Yeah, I would say that you know, we are at, I feel, at least with the primary schools, we are at a crossroads. If we do business as usual, when schools open, you just go back to just doing your usual grade level teaching, then it's a clear signal that we want to go down this very inequitable path that we've been on, and that schools are really going to continue to be used as a filtration system to just take a few people much further along and leave everybody behind. And that's the basic design. However, if we really want to come back and think about what will it take to take my 30% to 100%, spend money, change things around, do things differently, then it would be that we are putting, at least in the early stages, equity and, you know, opportunity to go ahead right at the center. So, you know, we don't need to wait another 25 years. Even in 2 years' time, it will be clear which way we are headed. And that will be basically, I think, you know, I mean, I'm exaggerating a bit, but that will basically set India's trajectory for the next 50 years.
Great. Yeah, thank you.
The only thing I'll say is that the last 2 years have actually seen a widening of all kinds of inequality. You know, rural, urban, male, female, caste groups, religious groups, etc. The wealth inequality in India, the increase of the top particularly two individuals and their, you know, business houses versus the bottom 50%, the widening gap. You know, it's the sort of K-shaped curve. And so I think that the biggest challenge that India is going to face going forward is inequality.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for that. I'll move on to the next question here from Hina Tangri, who's asking, how do you think the NGO working in the educational sector are making a difference? And what more can NGOs do to improve the percentage of students completing their schooling and further going on to pursue higher education? And that's to any of the panelists who want to address that.
And since I am an NGO in the schooling sector, I mean, it'll be very unlikely that I'll say we are making no difference whatsoever, right? I think it depends on what you're doing and where it fits into the larger landscape. There are some who are just providing more of, there's always a need for provision and for sort of connecting things. And there are others who are actually identifying gaps and coming up with solutions or different ways of thinking. So, I think it's very difficult to generalize. But I would like to say that, this completing of schooling and heading to higher education, I think is frankly.
Oh, I think Dr. Banerjee just froze. I think others are okay. Any of the other panelists? Oh, yeah. Oh, there we go.
Which it doesn't, yeah.
Okay. Dr. Banerjee, you hit froze there for a minute, but I think we got the gist of the core parts of your message. Any other comments on the NGO piece?
I actually would like to come in on that.
Please.
So I think there is one mother NGO and set of NGOs about whom we really need to be worried about, which is the RSS, which is really controlling the higher education sector right now in a massive way. So for instance, just to give you an example, there's something called the Research for Resurgence Foundation, which is an RSS front, which has managed to get central universities and state governments belonging to the BJP to basically promote it through official channels. So they conduct competitions in getting to know your local rivers, and people have to pay a fee to participate in these competitions, etc. So they get money. They mobilize student participation and data, and this is actively pushed. There's no kind of, open competition for which NGOs or which think tanks can be involved in education. So there's all sorts of ways in which the RSS is controlling the university. And I think this is actually an example of how dangerous NGO participation is when it's in collusion with the government. And this is not to say anything about all the excellent NGOs that are working in the field of education, especially primary education, especially Rukmini. So I'm just talking about higher education where NGOs don't usually work, but this is one example where they are very pernicious.
Thanks for that insight and I think an important nuanced point on the NGOs. Maybe I see that there's a brave soul who has raised his hand. John Harris has a hand raised in the chat, and maybe I'll ask John Harris, I guess is the name. I'm just seeing the name there. Go ahead, John.
That's me. Can you hear me?
We can, yes.
Okay. First of all, thank you all three very much for three really excellent presentations, and all very, very, very clear. And my question, actually, though, is for Rukmini, really. I thought you gave an extraordinarily clear presentation, a statement of what the fundamental sort of problem in basic education is. I wonder, though, could you just talk a little bit more about how that problem is to be fixed? Because so many other problems come into play. Think of the problems of, well, the ways in which teachers are recruited, the sort of people who get into teaching in schools, and then of course the problems of the absenteeism of teachers and so on. The whole sort of basic problem that you drew attention to of the sort of rigidity of the age grade system. So yeah, just would really love to hear from you a little bit more about how you think, what the most important things to be done are to fix the problem.
So let me say at the outset that I did not plant this question. but I was hoping somebody would ask it. Because, one of the main things that we've been doing for the last 20 years is firstly, heightening the awareness that there is this big learning gap and that it needs to be fixed. But it's not sufficient to just say that there is a gap. You have to also demonstrate how to fix it. And again, if I was able to show you the picture of, say, 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade, and think about each grade as a row, and then think of columns about in a way that our children are at different levels. So in each of these 3 grades, there are kids who, even though they've been in school for a few years, can't read letters. Some can read words, some can read sentences, but still can't read a long story. Now, the way our school system is structured is that it's really by age and grade, and it's by a row. And you have one teacher who's trying to tackle all these children with different learning levels in her same grade. And so, John, the approach that we have evolved over a period of time, and evolved completely, I would say, based on these contexts that we see in India, is to say, what about for a couple of hours a day, you group children across these grades, not by rows, but by columns. So that if I have 3 teachers or 2 teachers in 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade, they don't teach the whole combination of children in that grade. But let's say if there is Ashwini, Rukmini, and Nandini, Nandini gets the group of kids across these grades who are at, say, a letter level, or who are not even recognizing letters. Rukmini gets all the kids who are at word level, but not able to read higher than that. And Ashwini has the fun job of working with the readers who can go ahead. Now, this method is called teaching at the right level, which we have developed over a period of time, has been evaluated many times. If you do this, these kids who are stuck in anything like 30, 40, 50 days of a couple of hours a day really begin to make progress. So it's really, there's no extra resources. I mean, there is a shift in mindset about how you organize instruction, but it doesn't require a lot of extra resources. And my final point is, at this time of COVID, if you look at what has been in a typical year, the growth of this basic skill over time, it's usually in the range of 10, 12, 15 percentage points. But the teaching at the right level in less than 3 months can give you up to 25 or 30 percentage points within a government school system, which has all the problems of, that John spoke about. So we do have solutions. And if we were to use them today, it is possible that you may come back, far better place than before COVID hit us.
Great, thank you for that. I see that there's a second hand from our fearless leader there, Sharada. Do you want to, yeah, go ahead, please.
Yeah, thanks, Franco. Fantastic interventions by the 3 speakers. And like I said in the chat, sometimes you sit here and you wonder, but haven't we said all this so many times before? The question I have is mainly for Nandini, but I also would like to hear from Rukmini and Ashwini about this. So the current rage in India and certainly in China seem to be of getting foreign universities to come to India and set up shops. So the recent budget actually talked about the special education zone, particularly in Gujarat, to be set up for foreign universities. So where do foreign universities and hires of foreign graduated faculty within Indian universities, so where do they fit into the sort of vision that the 3 of you have articulated? What does it mean, Rukmini, for our school education? So what are we now aspiring for in terms of what are the sort of universities our children will be going to? And Ashwini, what does this mean for, especially for female labor force participation? That's been such a vexing problem, right? I mean, are we now going to then see better participation rates that we have foreign universities, and presumably people going to study in these foreign university campuses set on India, or to universities where foreign faculty are teaching. So I just want to get a sense of where do foreign universities, the idea of inviting foreign universities to India and of people educated abroad coming into and being hired into universities, where do all that fit into the sort of vision that we are talking about for education in 2046? Thank
you. So can I go first?
Please.
Yeah. So it fits into the government's plan to make it into the global indices, to the global rankings for Indian universities. So one of the major criteria for ranking is internationalization. So both of students and of faculty. And Indian universities have historically done very badly on this international index. So that's really why they want to get international faculty and foreign universities to tie up. And it's very much in line also with funding, a few institutes of eminence, which are again going to be targeting the global rankings. So it's part of the kind of prestige projects or advertising of the Indian government without actually looking at the university system in a holistic way and what is required. And there's also the question of which almost everybody has now forgotten. In the 60s, there was a big debate about Swaraj or self-governance in universities, how one might actually begin to develop autonomous sources of thought which were not following trends. I'm talking about the social sciences, which were not following international trends just because they were fashionable, and to come up with. So that whole kind of strand of thinking has now also been completely buried, even though the government is talking about, indigenization and so on of culture and learning. So thanks.
Great, thank you. Any other comments on that one? I'm conscious of time, but if there's any other.
Just a quick response in terms of female labor force participation. I don't think it's going to make any difference, because the reason that female labor force participation is low is not because women are not well trained, or I don't accept that. I think it's a much more complicated problem, most of all to do with the nature of jobs that are getting created or not getting created, more likely. So one is there's a problem of joblessness for everyone. Unemployment is at an all-time high. And within that, women are particularly disadvantaged. And the opportunities for women to be involved in paid work are shrinking, combined with their domestic, reproductive labor responsibilities. So I doubt if the entry of foreign universities is going to change any of these factors. So I think that's a whole set of other factors that we need to focus on.
Well, first of all, let me take this opportunity to thank again all the panelists. I did have a question around STEM, the science, technologies, mathematics, and the more technical disciplines that India is profiled so well around the world for. How it seems to me that some of the biggest questions and challenges that face us in the future are actually social science and humanities questions. They're fundamental questions around equity, around how we organize it, social justice, these kinds of things. How do the panelists think what are some of the ideas around how do we increase the premium that's placed on the social sciences education, which I think are going to be key as a foundation for future decision-making and policy formation. The more socially science and humanities oriented education that we have, the more we're going to be informed by those areas in terms of how we approach complex decision-making for our societies. And by the way, I'm speaking as someone who's on the STEM side in my professional career, but who hugely appreciates the importance of the social sciences.
Rukmini, or
please go ahead, anybody.
I mean, I would at this point, I would hesitate to advocate any push towards this or that direction, because I'm also very worried about what shape that push might take, and so I think, for all-rounded development, all subjects are needed. For example, the university where I'm at, Ashoka, which started off as a liberal arts and continues to be, now it's pushing in the direction of science, because those faculties didn't exist in the university. So I believe that trend will make it more all-rounded. I think it's not so much social science versus STEM as much as it is developing critical thought and ability to think critically and progressively, regardless of whichever discipline. I think the challenge for India is really that, rather than, I would say, social science versus this direction or that direction. I think what we are all struggling to hold on to is India's very rich heritage in pioneering critical thinking and very complex ability to produce knowledge around very complex subjects, very deep-rooted knowledge. So India has had some outstanding scholars, both in the social sciences and humanities and sciences. And I think it's that heritage and that legacy that needs to be strengthened and taken forward, rather than regressing into some view of the world that is not scientific. And I don't mean scientific in a technical sense, but I mean not informed by scientific rigor. So I would think of that as a bigger challenge than just a disciplinary shift in this way or that.
Great. Well, thank you very much. And I think your point on the critical thinking is exactly right. I was just thinking in terms of the goalposts that define, our base education to make sure that people have that foundation for critical thinking. But look, I'm conscious of time, and I was adamant about trying to stick to the to our backstop, which we've just passed it by a minute or so. So I want to, again, first of all, thank all the participants for showing up. I'm not sure what time it is in your part of the world, but it's just before lunchtime here in Canada, in Toronto. But thank you all. A particular shout out and thank you to the panelists for just a great set of presentations and also insights that touched on really important nuances in what are very obviously very complex issues, and also to Sharada for her leadership in teeing all this up as part of the broader India 2047 speaker series. So on that note, I want to again say thank you and to all of you, and look forward to hopefully crossing paths again. And I think that the speakers we may stay on. Sharada, do you have any maybe you can send a chat about that. But again, thank you to everyone. Goodbye.